is a D6 generation pip. Yeah, one of those dots on the side of a six-sided die. Yeah, a pip. A short pip. Little something. About anything gaming related. Sometimes featuring Craig, sometimes featuring Russ. We'll see what's coming up today.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another Pip. Russ here, going solo again, and I wanted to kind of give you guys an update today on my game. I guess it's my game collection. I don't want to say culling because I'm not really feeling compelled to necessarily reduce the collection, but it's sort of a funny thing. I going through my collection and organizing it and kind of getting my the shelves all put in my room and the games all organized and displaying them all. I'm coming to the realization that, it's great because I find the games quickly I want to play. But I'm also realizing how many games I have that maybe are now, I don't know if outdated is the right term based on theme, because there's some games that I know for certain I'm never going to get rid of. So for example, StarCraft, the board game, the original sort of coffin-sized box of Rune Wars. Those games are, in my mind, classics, and I like to break out like StarCraft, I think, once a year or so. I'm behind on that, though. I got to get that back to the table and just play it. It just has good nostalgia. Anyway, I like that one. I think I've talked about that before on the show, even though you could probably argue some of the mechanics are a little dated and all that sort of thing. It's just really special to me, so that's why that's there. But other games, like, for example, as I was cleaning up, I realize I have the brand new-ish, Eclipse Second Dawn, new version of Eclipse, which loving it, love all the components, love everything about it. I think I've talked about it a little bit before. But then I also realized in cleaning out my game closet that I also had the original Eclipse. And of course, I'm never going to play the original Eclipse again with Second Dawn in my collection. So off the original Eclipse goes to the local game store to be auctioned off to hopefully a happy home, and I get a little bit of store credit. So that kind of stuff is happening, right? But there's also some of these games that I'm finding, like I talked about a couple pips ago here on Smash Up, where I found Smash Up, the card game, hadn't played it a long time, played it once, everyone fell in love with it. I ended up buying still more expansions for it, and I played it some more, and now it's been making it to the table quite a bit. So fun game, great to have found it again. And I wanted to share with you sort of this process now that I wanted to start to use to sort of look at the rest of my game collection and sort of see what I should do there. So as I'm going through the back corners and nooks and crannies of my old game closet, pulling things out, adding them to the display shelves, deciding, if there's a newer version of the game and get rid of it, I'm finding some games that I got to make a decision on. And I can't remember, or I can't decide just by looking at it if I'd like to keep it or not. So I got to get it back to the table. Now, this works out pretty well because my younger daughter, Kit, who is now 17, she's obviously still living at home and going into senior year of high school next year. And so she and I have a tradition, which I haven't really named it this with her, but in my head, this is what it's called. It's called Bagels and Board Games. And every Sunday, she gets to sleep in as late as she'd like, and then we go out to the local bagel shop, get some bagels together, and then we come home and we play one board game. Actually, we play one game together. It's not always a board game. It's been board games, but sometimes, we found the video game, co-op game, It Takes Two. I think that's what it's called, It Takes Two. Fantastic. We played that through several Sundays to get that one done. But usually it's a board game. For example, we got to Role Player, which I really enjoyed. She and I played Smash Up, several other games. And so going through my collection, I'm finding some of these old two-player games that I'm starting to think about, well, is this the kind of thing that I want to keep? Is it the kind of thing that Kit and I would enjoy on Bagel and Board Game Sunday? So, because maybe it's a good one to keep around then. And the other thing I'm looking for a little bit is I'm always looking for, sorry about that. I just realized I was too close to the mic and I'm clipping a little bit. So hopefully this is a little better. I'm just kind of leaning into the conversation. Sorry about that. So the other thing I was thinking about was like, it's nice to have some good two-player games. I used to be focused more on three-player games. My oldest daughter was still in the house. Of course, she's away at college now. So I'm thinking, well, it'd be nice to have some more two-player games because as you know, you guys will know, they were playing a lot of the Song on Ice and Fire campaign, and sometimes some members of the campaign group have to cancel, which delays it. And my brother and I are kind of hanging around. It wouldn't it be good to have a 2-player game that he and I could play as well? So I thought, wow, it'd be good to go through the sort of the back nooks and crannies of my board game collection, see if there's any good 2-player games in there that Kit and I can start playing on Sundays, and then also see if it's the kind of thing maybe I break out with John or others when a 2-player game makes a lot of sense. So anyway, going through the back closet, I found 3 that I wasn't sure about and needed another play. So the 3 I found, Mage Wars, Crossmasters Arena, and Battleship Galaxies. Now looking at these games, they're all reasonably old, right? They're all like in the realm of, 8 to 10 years old. But they're also all kind of neat. Like I remember thinking when I played them, boy, these are really unique. So for example, Mage Wars, I just remember it being very unique when it came out. And in fact, we're going to dive into Mage Wars in a minute because that's the one I played through with Kit most recently. But we actually did review Mage Wars prior on the show. We reviewed Mage Wars way back when it first came out in the D6 Generation episode 115, which was December 2012. So it is just about 10 years old. And we gave it a really thorough review. So if you want like all the rules and how it works, and you're still interested in Mage Wars, by the way, it's still out there. You can still buy it. There are many expansions for it. So it's by no means a dead or retired game. It's not hard to get. So definitely take a listen to episode 115 if you want all the details on Mage Wars. But these 3 games are sitting around Crossmasters Arena, which I have many figures for. So it makes Crossmasters Arena sort of interesting to me and not an immediate sort of get rid of these, even though I haven't played any of these 3 games in like easily 5 or 6 years, right? So it's been a long time. So I'm like, well, Mage Wars, I remember being interesting. Haven't played it in forever. Why is that? Let's take a look. Did I just forget about it? Or was there things about it I didn't care for? And should I retire it from the collection? Crossmasters, similarly, Crossmasters is a very cute game. Tons of really cool miniatures. Miniatures is the wrong word. They're almost like, they're little 3-dimensional, sort of almost, they're not pop figures, but they're pop figure-ish. They sort of came out, I think they predate the pop figure phase, but they tried to sort of get in on that action or that idea where there's all these really cool they're not even really painted because they're like pop. They're sort of pre-colored plastics. And they're all these really interesting sort of chibi anime style little figures. Each figure has a stats card. And then there's this, it's actually a 2 to 4 player sort of heads up arena fighting game, right? Which is why it's called Crossmasters Arena. So it seems like a kind of an interesting little fighting game plus cute figures. I think I had it originally because the girls were younger and these sorts of things really appealed and it was fun to collect them. I remember my youngest daughter was really into them. She had a little hat she would wear that was based on one of the figures. And so they really liked it. So it was one of those games, I think, way back at a Gen Con or something we picked up. We played it a few times. So that one I kind of want to get back to the table and decide, is it still fun? Was there more meat on the bones there? Or was it just sort of a cutesy game that needs to be retired? And then the third game I want to get to the table is Battleship Galaxies. This game is fascinating because it is an official battleship, like the Hasbro game where E5, miss, that battleship. But it takes place in space and it's actually, except for the title and the fact that you could argue there are space battleships, it's actually nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with the original Battleship game, other than those little cute colored pegs that used to stick on the board are actually stuck into the base of the miniatures. Yep, that's right. There's miniatures that to track like damage and shields and things like that. So it's actually a naval space combat game with pre-painted miniatures. And I remember it being pretty interesting, actually. So, and I remember the miniatures being pretty cool. And so I want to try these 3 games. So I'm figuring, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to bring these 3 games out to each of my bagels and board game sessions with my daughter, Kit, and we're going to see how they stand up, right? So this is the first report of those, and I will share the other reports as they go along. So last weekend, we played Mage Wars. Now, what was interesting about Mage Wars, the premise of Mage Wars, and again, if you want to hear the full detailed review, I don't expect you to go back and listen to this episode, but if you want to, if you're like, that sounds sort of interesting, I think my gaming crew would like this. I want to go get it. If you want to listen to a very detailed review of all exactly how the mechanics work, you can go ahead and listen to episode 115. But when summarizing it to Kit, I said, "Hey, Kit, it's a magic user dueling game where each player assumes the role of a spellcaster, and there's different kinds of spellcasters, right? So there's a druid style spellcaster, and there's a beastmaster style spellcaster, and there's a warlock who's obviously got more demon stuffs going on, and then there's like a priest, and then there's expansions that have come out." But so this is already intriguing to her. She's like, "Okay, but is it just a card game?" I'm like, well. Now, she is a big fan of Summoner Wars, another interesting game in my collection because I have the original Summoner Wars, which we love. We still play Summoner Wars pretty regularly on iOS when we're sitting around bored. And big fan of that. And I know they just rebooted Summoner Wars with all new art, all new set. And so now I'm torn, like, do I go get the new one? I kind of still have the classic one. Is the nostalgia going to be lost with the new? Anyway, that's another story. See, these are first world gamer problems I have to deal with every day, just so people understand the level of complexity in my life. So anyway, so back to Mage Wars here. So I'm describing this to my daughter, and I'm saying, look, you play these two spellcasters, and she's played spellcasters in Dungeons and Dragons before. Her first big campaign, she was a druid, so she's into all that stuff. And she likes animals, and she's an animal type person. I'm thinking, well, the Beastmaster could be something she would think was cool. And I think the interesting part of this game, and she likes Summoner Wars, and so I'm like, well, it's kind of like Summoner Wars where you actually have a game board, and your cards become your pieces when they're deployed, and they move around. So in addition to your spellcaster moving around, your spellcasters will create or summon creatures that also move around the board. So the Beastmaster will have lots of animal creatures. The Warlock will have lots of, demons and fell creatures and that kind of stuff, right? So it makes sense. It's a little Summoner War-y-ish, too. So that's another question for me, right? Like, is this adjacent to Summoner Wars? Is it a replacement Summoner? Is it completely different? But there is a very interesting mechanic in this game that makes it very different from pretty much any other card-driven game you play. And that is, in many different card-driven games, right, each player has a deck of cards, and in some card-driven games, there's deck builders, right, where you build your deck while you play. There's some card-driven games where the decks are fixed. There's some card-driven games where you pick your deck and adjust your deck prior to the game. Summoner Wars is one of these, right, where you can pick your faction decks, but then also you can kind of adjust what cards are in your deck. But in all these games, what they all have in common, including deck building games, which is your deck is literally a pile on the table, and you draw some number of cards into your hand, and you're playing from your hand. So there's always some amount of luck involved, right, in terms of your hand draw, right? And so a big part of these games is going through your deck and getting the right cards in your hands at the right time. That's part of it. So you need hand management and all these other mechanics, which is fine. And that's what makes all these games the same. Mage Wars has one very, very different component to it that gives the game a completely different feel, but it also perfectly matches the theme. And the way they do this is inside the game box, there are two little portfolio books that are used to store all the cards. So these are your spell books, okay? And these are not unusual books. You can get them at any of your favorite collectible card game stores, right? Because they're where you could store your magic cards when you're sorting them and organizing them when you're not using them, so you can find the right ones for deck building. So it's one of these little books, right? And they're smallish, and they fit in the game box easily, and they're themed. But what you do before the game starts, you have all these decks of cards, right? And then when you build your spell book and you go through and you take the cards that are appropriate for your spellcaster and you put them into this book. Now, the game rules come with predefined lists, so you don't have to do any thinking. You just build the lists for the casters that the game comes with. But you can also, if you get really into the game, you can spend off hours kind of optimizing the spell deck. There are the spell books, so there's rules for this. So you build the spell book out with all the cards in it facing out, so you can flip through the spell book and see them all. But here's the interesting thing. They stay in the spell book during gameplay. There actually is no deck, right? Instead, during your turn, you look at your entire spell book, which is all the cards your spellcaster has access to, and you play directly from the book. So there is no deck, there is no hand. You have access to everything that you made for your caster, right? Which is very different than any other card-based game, right? Now, the awesomeness of this is it also feels like a spellcaster because you're going through the book. So I'm describing this to my daughter in the car, and I'm telling her that. She goes, wow, this she's like, I'm kind of getting into this. It sounds cool. I can summon creatures. I got this whole spell book. This sounds really neat. I'm down for this. And then as we're sitting at the table getting ready to play, right, we're talking about it some more, and she's seeing all the art, which is stunning, right? The art in Mage Wars is fantastic. Now, the game board itself is pretty drab. It looks like a dungeon floor. I mean, there's little nods to some things around in the dungeon, but it's a pretty drab game board, right? But I think that's by design, because as you put cards into the game board, you're going to end up having many cards running around, and they're full of colorful art, and so you don't want the game board sort of distracting from that. So I understand that design choice, right? So you're playing directly from your spellbook. You're bringing the cards, and she's looking at this, and she's like, wow. Now, the rulebook's a little intimidating, and Kit likes complex games. She likes strategy games. She's not afraid of heavy games. However, she does not like long games and games that are counterintuitive or a little weird. So I was a little nervous about this one because I remember it being rules heavy, which didn't put her off. I said, the rule book's kind of big. She goes, that's okay. But I also remember it being long, and I was worried it might be a little long. So anyway, we figured all this out, and we went through the rule book. And the good thing is the rule book, yes, it's intimidating, but really the majority of the rule book is spent explaining one-off cases and specialized cards and types of cards. But the actual mechanics themselves, they're summarized very well in the back of the book and also in the quick reference materials. So it's actually not that hard to get into. Plus, there are some good Watch It Played videos out there, thanks to Roddy and others. So very easy to get started in the game. So we started playing it, and initially she was really getting into it. Oh yeah, this is cool. Oh, I got a ferret. Oh, I got this, and I'm summoning my guys, and we're getting ready to go. But I then remembered about halfway through the game what one of the problems was with the game when you have repeated plays. And she found it along too. What you think it might be is the analysis paralysis involved in the entire spell book. But that's actually not so bad. So during your opponent's turn, you can be looking at your spells, and you're kind of trying to get guys out. And if you've organized your spell book pretty well, it's really not that hard. It's sort of like, oh, this is the section of all the creatures I can summon. These are the section of all the spells I can cast. And there's some cool combos. Like I've created a magic wand on my spellcaster. I summoned a forge onto the table, and then that forge each round can cast equipment spells that I can put on my warlock, right? I'm playing the warlock and she's playing the Beastmaster. And that's cool. And then this particular thing, I just created a magic wand out of my forge. And the magic wand says you can attach a spell to it. Because normally when you cast a spell, not only do you pay the cost, but the spell then goes into a discard pile. So every spell in the game is basically one use. So that's another thing you want to think about is, as you're playing through your spell book, you're kind of burning through the spells your wizard has access to, and you're running out of options. So over time, you're going to burn through everything you have. Now, there's a lot. I mean, like 50, 60 cards in there. So it's going to take a while, and you're probably not going to run options before the game is ended. But what's kind of neat about the wand is I can attach a spell to it, and then I can still pay for the mana cost of casting the spell, but the spell doesn't leave the wand. So the wand's like it's a wand of fireballs or whatever attached to it. So that was pretty cool. So I got that going on, and she's got all of her beasts running around, and she's able to amp up her beasts and give them cool stuff. And so that's cool. And everything was going great. And we're kind of like, so how does it end? And it's, the way it ends is kind of like Magic. You get to kill the other guy's leader. So we all have a lot of hit points. Like, I don't know, it depends on your leader, but somewhere in the 30s or 40 hit points range. And so you got to wipe them out. And of course you can damage them, but they can heal, and killing the other creatures is interesting, but that doesn't really get you to your goal, which is damaging the caster. So you got to get to the caster, and the caster's a piece on the table. And so the other beasties can try to protect him. And so basically you're building a little army of either summoned creatures or whatever, and they're fighting it out. And you're trying to get to their wizard right in the end of the day. So this brings us to the problem we ran into, which was we played the game to the end. It was interesting. It was strategic. We enjoyed it. And initially as we're playing it, we're talking through like, oh, this is going to be fun to play over and over again because there's 2 other casters that come in the box. And then there's these other expansions. And look, they've added expansions that are kind of spellcaster adjacent, like paladins and stuff. Those would be neat to see how they work. And we're talking about this, and we're definitely in like the first hour or 2, which is, you've learned the rules in the first hour, so you don't really count that as gameplay time, even though you started playing a little bit, you're still fiddling with it. Second hour, you're pretty much fully into the game, and you're at sort of like if you're to graph like the happiness level of the players, you're like really into this, and you're building your army, and you're seeing the mechanics and seeing how the game works. Now, hopefully, if it's a good game, in a game of your particular type, that little happiness keeps going up or plateaus and stays very high until the dramatic ending. And maybe you have a little emotional dip if you lose, but you still thought it was cool and you can't wait to play again, right? So in this case, though, the happiness meter started to drop down a little bit as we realized it's very easy to turtle, as they say in real-time strategy games, or just play super defensively, or there's no actual timer on the game. And this is a complaint I have of a lot of games. If you build a game without a timer, in other words, there's no turn limit, there's no forcing function for the guys to fight. If one of your players is pretty much like, I just want to summon lots of creatures. Look, here I go, boop, 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 boop. And they never leave their thing, or I never aggressively charge my opponent, it never ends. Like it just could never end. Now, you would eventually all run out of spells and options, and eventually you would just charge your wizards at each other and fight. Now, of course, there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do, like you can sneak around in the flank and surprise your opponent and get I imagine there's ways to get kind of quick deaths if you can really fake your opponent out and stuff. But there isn't really it's not like a miniature game where there's a turn limit where and then 6 turns it's just going to be over and you've got whatever victory points you've got, right? And so I think that's the missing piece, unfortunately, of Mage Wars, and probably why it's not going to stay in our collection. Because unfortunately, we ended up playing for about 4 hours, beginning to end, including learning time. Now, again, I'm going to chop the learning time off, so now it's a 3-hour game, right? And my daughter said, I don't know, Dad, it kind of outstays its welcome, which it does. I think it would be much cooler. Like, here's the interesting thing. It didn't bother her that we sat down and played board games for 4 hours. I think Mage Wars would have been a winner if we played it for 4 hours, because after the first 2 hours, we'd learned it, and then she beat me, and I said again, and she said, yeah, and we did it again for 2 more hours, now knowing the rules, or another hour and a half, and then I beat her. That would have left us wanting more, and that's okay. Because like with Smash Up, we played Smash Up for 4 hours straight, just over and over again, but they're a bunch of short games, right? So it's not that she doesn't want to sit down and play a game for 4 hours. It's that this game outstays its welcome for 4 hours. You kind of want to start over again and try something different after 2 hours of the same situation. And so that's what its weakness is. It kind of comes from that era of games. I don't know if this is a time period or just a style of game. Some people may really like this, by the way, where the games can be endless, that they can go all day. And this has been one of my complaints of Twilight Imperium since we pretty much started the show, where some of these games can go on forever. And one of the things I like about when we talk about games like 4X games, like Eclipse: A Second Dawn or Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea, when you can compare them to a game like Twilight Imperium, these games have very fixed time limits in them. And so even in an epic game with lots of players and lots going on, it ends in a reasonable amount of time, where TI could literally go for days and days, sort of thing. I'm being a little dramatic. I know in more recent editions of TI, they've kind of brought that in a little bit. But long story short, I think Mage Wars suffers from that problem. And unfortunately for kids, a deal breaker. And I think when in a generation of games where I have many choices, I think that's a deal breaker for me too, which is a shame, because I love the idea of Mage Wars. I like the idea of the spell books. I like the idea of the two mages fighting. I like the Summoner Wars-esque elements of this. And by the way, I want to say Summoner Wars came out after Mage Wars. They don't feel like the same game, but the mechanics are sort of the same, where you're putting cards down and fighting. And Summoner Wars is a much more R-style game. I don't want to say better, because that's not really fair. It's a much more R-style game of that ilk, where each side has one sort of spellcaster summoner, and you're cranking out dudes to fight each other. Now, it doesn't have the cool mechanic of Mage Wars. You don't really feel like your mages fighting each other in Summoner Wars, right? You feel like you have an army of creatures, and there's just this mechanic where there's this person summoning them, but in the end of the day, you feel like you're fighting with two armies. It feels more like a skirmish game of, like War Machine or 40K or Warhammer Fantasy, and less like two mages dueling. Whereas Mage Wars really captures this idea that I'm this powerful spellcaster, and I have a book of spells, and I can do anything. I can cast fireballs. I can make it rain down lightning upon you. I can do that, and you can do all that stuff. It's awesome. Get all of her guys together, and she's like, this is the part of the game where you would just hit me with a fireball. And I'm like, look, fireball. And, so like that part all worked. And that's what makes it a shame, because the art is fantastic. The mechanics are fundamentally fantastic. it just needs a timer. It needs, I don't mean a physical, actual timer. I mean some kind of mechanic which forces you to either engage or, maybe instead of having the objective be kill each other wizard, there's centrally located things in the middle, power crystals or something that you're trying to control. And by either killing them or grabbing them, you're generating victory points. And maybe there's a number of turns, something to speed it up. Not from a mechanics point of view, from an endless, grind of just sending out creatures and having them smash against each other, is sort of what happens. Now I know Summoner Wars is sort of a similar thing where you're trying to kill their summoner, but for some reason, the mechanics of Summoner Wars, the playtime of Summoner Wars, the speed of each round of Summoner Wars is fast enough. And I didn't mean for this to become Summoners versus Mage Wars. It just did in my head. I don't know why. I guess it's because there's cards in the table counting as models, but I feel like it's a slightly better flavor. So I'm not suggesting, by the way, that you should either have Summoner Wars or Mage Wars. All I'm suggesting is that for our family, Mage Wars is not going to make the cut, which is a shame because I really do love the idea of it. But I'm looking at this big pile of stuff and I'm like, yeah, would I really, given my daughter's reaction and my brother saying, hey, let's play a 2-player game, would I grab Mage Wars? No, because I now know it. Someone who's not a huge, I love, an 8-hour board game one-on-one. I'm not saying Mage Wars is 8 hours. It's not that bad. I'm exaggerating, but that's sort of the feel of it. So anyway, that's our thoughts on Mage Wars. And so it's going to be leaving my collection. Unfortunately, I'm going to be after I record this, I'm going to be moving it to my bag of things to take to the game store auction in the garage. But the next two coming up, we'll be talking about Crossmasters Arena and Battleship Galaxies. I'm going to see what my daughter, it is Sunday morning right now when I'm recording this, D6G Sunday, new content every Sunday. And that's been working out pretty well, by the way. Thank you for everyone for downloading and keeping an eye out. So we've been for about 2 months now, every Sunday, I've been posting new content, either one of our D&D episodes or something new that we've recorded here. And hopefully that's been helpful. But yeah, so today after this, my daughter will be getting up shortly here and we're going to go get bagels. And then we're either going to be playing Crossmasters Arena or Battleship Galaxies. I'll let you guys all know how that goes. Until next time.
Achievement unlocked! You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@thed6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.